It is time to overanalyze Vegapunk and his satellites. Their story obviously isn't done yet. Lilith is still alive. York still runs free. We still have the brain that has everything that they've uploaded in it as well. But this is a video that I've been wanting to do for a while, and it's finally time. Let's overanalyze Vegapunk. And we're gonna start with his satellites. So what are his satellites? In Vegapunk's own words, he describes them as, each of them is an expert in one of my necessary facets. All 6 of them together possess one complete copy of my personality, but they can do 6 times as much. Because their personalities and duties are distinct, each one's experience are worthwhile and unique. So their moniker isn't their entire personality, rather it's their specialty or their core selves that they built up from. But they are also a copy of Vegapunk himself. And because of this, I think that we can learn a lot about Vegapunk by studying his satellites. That said, I do think that each of the satellites have grown from that core self, from that isolated trait. They've grown into their own personhood. Partially, I believe this because that's a big thing that was honed in on in this arc, is that of a person who isn't created in the typical sense, a clone, a cyborg, even a hologram, that their personhood is respected and is valued. And I think that that theming is also given to the satellites, that they have their own individual personhood despite also being a piece of Vegapunk himself. We are, of course, at the end of the video going to talk about the Stella himself, as well as draw the clear inspiration that Oda took from Einstein and Oppenheimer in creating Vegapunk's arc. Vegapunk also made clear that what he did when he created the satellites was to isolate a single component from the human mind, and naturally one might assume that the one called evil is the one that will betray them, the one that will rebel. And Vegapunk himself thought so too. But for Vegapunk, the one that rebelled was greed. And personally, I think that's a reflection of Vegapunk himself. So first, let's look at all of the satellites and see what we can learn from them, and then let's analyze the Stella. Starting with Lilith the Evil. Lilith controls the beasts and is in charge of weather control. She keeps the temperatures perfect, and she creates atmospheres like Sky Island. With that, she's searching for an undying flame to help power the island. When we're introduced to her, she attempts to steal from the Straw Hats any valuables that they may have in order to get more money for her research. We oftentimes see her have evil, impulsive reactions to things that she doesn't like. And she, along with Edison and Pythagoras, lured the Straw Hats into a trap to fight S-Shark, one of the strongest beings on Earth, and pushed the experiment way too far. Without Shakka's intervention, who knows how far they would have pushed things. There are characters that are introduced to the story as thieves and who are willing to harm the Straw Hats for their own agenda, but it's later revealed that there's a deeper purpose there, one where the evil is committed for the sake of helping others. In Lilith's case, it's for self-gain, that is, to further her own research and curiosity. She's not trying to swindle and steal in order to pay off someone to gain someone else's freedom. She's trying to get enough money to further her own curiosity, her own interest, her own passion and desire for pushing the boundaries of science. I think this is justifiably called evil, even though we, the readers, may hear the moniker evil and think that that means someone who's looking to destroy, someone who's looking to conquer, to put themselves in a place of power no matter who it might hurt. We might think of a celestial dragon when we think of evil. Yet, that's what we get when greed is isolated instead of evil. And I think the reason for that is a reflection of Vegapunk himself. I think that a pure concentrated evil coming from him, coming as a copy of him, is more aligned with what piracy is. It's more aligned with stealing for your own interest, but not stealing and conquering for your own elevation or for the gratification of causing harm itself. Vegapunk doesn't want power or domination. He doesn't view other people as lower than himself inherently because of the way that they were born. However, he is willing to harm others if it means his own scientific advancement. And that's what we see displayed in Lilith. The label evil may not seem fitting for her because it's on the level of a pirate or on the level of someone whose first instinctual reaction to something is to lash out in a violent or angry or aggressive way, but it's not on the level of someone like a celestial dragon or like one of the five elders. But it is still a type of evil. It's just reflective of the type of evil that Vegapunk had in him. And I think that we can analyze his character through this lens. Next up, Atlas the Violent. Atlas's job is violence. More specifically, keeping the peace by force. When the giant dragon and robot got out of hand, she keeps them in line with her fists. When intruders CP0 arrive, she attacks them immediately, despite Shakka's warnings. And when the Straw Hats were attacked by yokai, she did her job to the very end by defending them with violence. In build, she's a large child, and she said she gets to choose her own form. It may be a stretch, but I wonder if violence in Vegapunk isn't a dominant trait, but an immature trait. It arrives in short, but large and violent bursts, but then once it's out, it's done. This could explain Atlas's young and cheery demeanor, but quick, violent outbursts that come from her as an initial reaction to things when she's upset or when she sees something that's out of order. Next up, Edison the Thinker. When York, Edison, and Pythagoras trap the Straw Hats with S-Shark, Edison watches on and is even excited that S-Shark is going to learn new moves through the combat. He's flighty when he gets a new idea, abandoning research entirely when idea comes to him, leaving Pythagoras to stay put and analyze the data. And for him as well, he was a thinker to the very end, calculating what kind of damage he would take on going through the barrier and how to strategically get their ship back to the water. He was also the one that had that really key conversation with Stussy about how she is valuable as a clone and that she should continue to live even if the Stella is gone. I think this is very reflective of how the Stella conducts himself in this flighty manner, but also in the fact that Stella, being a humble genius, being the smartest man on Earth, is largely reliant on his ideas, is largely reliant on his inventions, on what he can create, which is important when discussing the next satellite, Pythagoras the Wise. Pythagoras doesn't get a ton of page time because he's one of the first ones picked off and he didn't hold a huge role in the series, but I still think that we can analyze him. Much like Edison, he too takes the form of a robot, but one even more tiny than Edison, though he wears the appearance of a much larger robot. This is likely for practicality, but I think we can also look at how that relates to Vegapunk. A man who seems to have the brilliance of the world, but in many ways is largely lacking in wisdom. When you think of the smartest man in the world, you think of their ideas and their inventions and what they can bring to the world, like, free energy and the internet. But genius can only go so far when it's not paired with wisdom. And for Vegapunk, he appears to have true and pure genius, holistic genius. But outside of that casing is actually a much smaller robot reflecting a very small amount of wisdom. Vegapunk has so many ideas, he has so many inventions, but those inventions typically are then just left on the island and not actually brought into be utilized by the world. He comes up with ways to make the world better, but doesn't consider what the next step is, how to actually utilize it, how to actually put it in the hands of people. Or he abandons it when it has a flaw like the wrong color or like bugs being attracted to the lightsaber. It's a failure because it's not perfect, so it must be written off. This is also displayed in really big and essential ways, like the fact that Vegapunk truly believes that something like a satellite or a clone has its own personhood and should be treated as such. And he's completely outraged at the very idea of taking away Kuma's free will. In fact, it torments him to do so. Yet, he happily takes part in experiments and creations like the Seraphim and like the pacifistas. And he takes pride in those inventions. Yet, what he's done is he's taken He's created a living being that is servitude to other people's commands. They are required to follow the commands of the elders or whoever owns a command chip, or in the case of the pacifistas, Bonnie herself, which that was an act of mercy, but it still is servitude. And I think that inconsistency is intentional. One, because it reflects his lack of wisdom, how he has these amazing ideas, but he doesn't think it all the way through practically. But two, because I think that the themes of you can't program out a person's core instincts isn't done being explored in this arc. I think this is going to be a saga-wide discussion, and I think that the Seraphim and the pacifistas have been set up to have that core instinct that will allow them to continue to disobey orders, like we already saw displayed in S-Snake. So I do think we're going to continue to elaborate on this as we continue through chapters, but it is a display of Vegapunk appearing very inconsistent in what he believes versus how he acts, what his actions show. Next up, Shakka the Good. Shakka is the one that keeps balance in this system. When Lilith, Edison, and Pythagoras would have let the Seraphim potentially go too far in battling the Straw Hats, he's the one that stopped it. And when Atlas wanted to attack CP0, he's the one that told her to back down because it was not going to be an even match. Didn't work, but he tried. He also believes that preserving the Stella is the most important thing. He's willing to sacrifice himself and all of the satellites in order to keep the Stella alive. I do believe this is due to his nobility as good isolated, but it also could represent Vegapunk's ideal self, being an objective observer and one that makes balanced decisions. Shakka does wear a helmet, and we could assess that the reason he hides his face is that the good side of Vegapunk is usually the hidden side, the side that's more in the background, while it would serve the system well, it would serve the six of them well if he were their leader, because he's the calm, balanced one. Typically, he ends up being more in the background instead. Next up, we have York the Greedy. York lives on base urges to fuel everyone else. They use her indulgence for their own benefit so that they can do their jobs most efficiently. She uses their trust for her own benefit, too. In design, York, too, is very large. I think it's clear that greed takes up a large part of Vegapunk and that he's constantly trying to just invent more, do more, split himself into pieces, and isolate key components of himself so that he can just keep progressing and keep inventing and keep satisfying his desire for progress and for knowledge and for more. But the greed is also reflected in his ignorance, in that he wants to keep inventing and keep pushing forward rather than seeing those experiments through to the end. He has no care, he has no focus, he has complete naivete a lot of times in how those inventions are then going to actually be utilized. His ideals are good, he invents for the greater good, but instead of the follow-through, he's greedy and just continues inventing more. He doesn't have enough of that balance displayed in Shakka that is so greatly needed. He'll work with those that he morally disagrees with if it means that he'll get more funding. He'll leverage his ability to help in something that is a noble cause, like saving a child's life. He'll leverage his ability to help in that for the sake of trying out a new experiment. Ultimately, greed is Vegapunk's undoing in the small-scale mystery plotline that we got of one that betrayed him, but also in the larger-scale worldwide consequences. Bonnie said it well. Your endless quest for scientific knowledge will spare no one in its greed, including my father, who you turned into a mindless weapon of war. She was wrong about why he did this, but she was giving us a very clear clue in what part of him isolated would cause the most damage and destruction. Vegapunk wants us to believe that the ends justify the means, but truly, he is largely led by his own curiosity and desire to learn as much as he can and do as much as he can. At least he was for most of his life. Okay, now we've looked at all the satellites, let's talk about the Stella. While I was talking about York, I largely talked about Vegapunk's self-interest. But he is certainly not exclusively that. Vegapunk's dream is to provide free energy for all, as well as to make it possible for all of humanity to be able to update punk records regularly and share all of their collective knowledge, thereby creating an entire sea of knowledge that far surpasses even my vast intellect. His dream is, in concept, about sharing resources and knowledge, but he doesn't consider the application of the plans, or that different people with different ideals, worldviews, perceptions, etc. would upload information that's given through a filter of perspective, which is what Jinbei brings up on the same page. His response is, "Great question, but science will never advance if you spend all your time worrying about it." I think this scene sums up the conflict between good and intellect versus wisdom in Vegapunk very well. His desires for what's right and good for humanity are great, but he doesn't follow through to see what they would actually look like in action or how they're going to affect the world in the wider picture, in the wider scheme of things. In the satellites and in the wider story, we see a man who is worthy of the title smartest man on Earth, but we also see a man who's so lacking in wisdom that I would argue that his wisdom is as much his greatest undoing as his greed is. We see his naivete illustrated in small things, like how Stella invited the Straw Hats onto the island, but when they utilized his resources, like the food and the clothes, they were hunted down, not just to be told, hey, you gotta pay for that's not free, but to actually, like, they tried to kill him. The pacifistas laser beamed them. We see it illustrated in island-wide ways, like how York abused the system that they had set up, uploading dummy information, taking advantage of Vegapunk just taking for granted that his experiment will be used correctly, much like he wants to invent this incredible incredible wealth of information, and Jinbei points out, but what about people uploading their own information through the filter of their worldview, and how that would make it not objective information every time? And Vegapunk's like, it'll work out. That is illustrated again in the way that York takes advantage of Vegapunk just taking for granted that every satellite will function exactly as he expected them to. And because of that, by the time he and Shakka and Pythagoras realized that there was a traitor among them, it was too late. And it's illustrated in worldwide cataclysmic ways, like that of the Mother Flame. The arc starts off by illustrating how his sea stone coating is being used to invade Amazon Lily, and it continues on into being used to destroy Lulicia. Which brings us finally to discussing the parallels between Vegapunk and Einstein and Oppenheimer. In 1939, Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt letting him know that the Nazis were working on an atomic bomb. This letter led to the US government researching making their own atomic bomb, which later was used in the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Oppenheimer was one of the greatest and most influential scientists in the world, and he was one of the main scientists on this project. He strongly disagreed with how the government would go on to use these weapons, and it tormented him to see what his research had contributed to. A quote from him, "I think that Hiroshima was far more costly in life and suffering, inhumane, than it needed to have been an effective argument for ending the war. This is easy to say after the fact." Einstein, too, regretted sending that letter, especially after seeing that the Nazis failed in creating their own atomic bomb. He called it the one great mistake of my life, and in one interview said, "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, I would have done nothing for the bomb." We see this reflected in the writings of Vegapunk. His agreement in working on a project that he was morally outraged by, and his deep regret after realizing how his own inventions were used to cause such devastation. Vegapunk flew too close to the sun, and this was the greatest regret of his life. Though we saw on full display the greatest mistakes of Vegapunk's life, we also saw how he was shaped and changed by the people around him, by Dragon challenging him, and more strongly by Clover challenging him and telling him about the history that he was seeking out. We saw Vegapunk live his life in the way that I've laid out up to this point in the video. But we also saw him take on the mantle of researching the Void Century, knowing exactly what it was going to cost him. We saw him take up the responsibility of protecting Bonnie, knowing that he would die for it. Vegapunk was not depicted in this story as a good person, and he had many regrets looking back over his life. But he did make the choice to research the Void Century, to rebel against the world government and protect Bonnie, and to, quote, "If I must die, it won't be for nothing," to get the message out to the people. We get to see how much Vegapunk changed in his lifetime through this arc. Having the broadcast end with a send-off to another pirate era and the revealing that he wants Luffy to be the Pirate King was the culmination of his character arc, having learned from his passivity and instead taking on an active role like was displayed to him in his friend Clover. It's fascinating that greed killed his goodness and his wisdom first in the whodunit plotline of the story. In the end, the world sees Vegapunk as a great man, amazing inventions, progressing the world, and warning them of what happened. But the two parts that are currently actively living today are greed and evil. And I certainly don't think that Vegapunk's story ends in this arc, just like I mean, obviously it doesn't. Greed and evil are still alive. And I don't think that the conversations, the themes that were stated in this arc are done here either. I think that they will continue to be explored moving forward, as will everything that we've discussed up to this point with Vegapunk, and I'm really curious to see what role Lilith is going to play moving forward. Vegapunk is such an interesting character. I actually have a couple pages more of notes of things that we could have dug into for his character, but I tried to have this video have focus, so I didn't delve into every little detail. But there's more we could talk about, so if you want to talk about it more in the comments, I would just love to hear your thoughts. I want to give a huge shout out to 3 of my patrons, Charaset, Kratos, and Kiyotari, who I sent my notes on this video to, and they gave me feedback and their own thoughts. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. Please do let me know what you think about Vegapunk. Let me know how you took his story and what kind of other things we could be digging into. I'll see you again soon. Bye.